making sure my 50 children are going to sleep. Let me shut the curtain. There we go. And we got that sticker that closes on the other side. So let's say goodnight to these ones first. I'm going to put my stuff down. So, good night, good night, good night, good night. So we said good night to this one, this one, this one. And good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. Whoa. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. So these are all the children I did. Just say good night to. But never mind. Let's get on to the next layer. Good night, good night, good night, good night, good night. And good night, 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 good night. Hold up, let me move. Was I up to you? Good night. See you next. Good night. Good night. Good night. And good night. Alright, now let me do these ones. Good night. Good night. Good night. Is it properly for big? Good night. Oh, what did I do to you? Right. Good night. 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 All right. Good night. 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 Back there. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. You should not be sleeping that way. And good night. Whoa. Right. Good night. Good night, Chip and Dip. Chip and Dip. Here's a twin right here. But fortunately, that Chip and Dip has to stay there. And good night. I don't want to turn you around, but right. I was hoping if you could see that. Why they turn around? Oh, why? Dear. So if you didn't see that one, good night. Good night. Good night, Grumpy. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night, Taco. Good night. So these were the ones. Let me just do this. Right. And these. And I forgot one. Whoa, what happened? Right, good night. Whoa, that's 51, 52, 53. I hope seeing all my children. I have a lot. Do you want to see the rest of my children up there? Up there. Alright. Alright, let's go. We go. Because you guys will fall down. We don't want that to happen. Right, so, they used to be up here. Yeah, I took them down. Good night. Good night. I don't know if there's any more. Why just the toys catch? Good night, Snack and Snack. Good night. Good night, who's ever under that blanket. My, jersey. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night, everyone. Whoa. I have too many children. I have more. Good night. Good night. Good night. And I squished. Good night. That's all the children I have. So yeah, I have a lot of children. I'm not kidding. I have so many. Yeah. Oh, I forgot one. Sorry. And good night. Whoa. So yeah, I literally have so much children. Yes. What do I do? Blanket, 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 blanket. Bye. 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 Thank you for watching. Putting all my children to bed. I mean, making sure my children are in bed. Hi. I'm Mr. Monkey. Oh no, you're squished. Oh no. Alright. Hope you like seeing all my children. Bye. Should I make videos with my children? I'll think about it. I think I am. I might, but yeah.